Hey everybody, I'm reading this while I'm sick, so it might suck, but forgive me if it does. The Economic Content of Socialism, Marx versus Lenin, by Paresh Chattopadhyay. I believe that's how you pronounce his name. I was pronouncing it before Chattopadhyay, but I think it's just Chattopadhyay. Again, I could be wrong on both of them, so bear with me. This is the abstract for the piece. Actually, I should probably say the date first. This is from the Review of Radical Political Economics, Volume 2, Issues 3 and 4. It's from 1992, so 31 years ago. It's the year I was born. Alright, so here's the abstract. Marxist socialism conceives of a society of free producers excluding private property in the means of production, commodity relations, wage labor, and the state. Lenin's socialism, while excluding commodity production, does not entirely eliminate wage labor and is based on state ownership of the means of production identified with social ownership. Lenin's socialism thus turns out to be very different from Marx's emancipatory project of association. I should also say that Paresh Chattopadhyay, his books are tremendous. I highly recommend reading his book, Socialism and Commodity Production. It's very good, and also, I forget what the other one's called. Marx's Associated Mode of Production is the other book, and his most recent one is something like Marx's Capital Towards like a De-Alienated Society or something like that, put out by the Marx Engels Marxisms book series that is edited by, I know it's edited by Marcelo Musto, but I think it's also edited by Terrell Carver, but I'm not sure. And then there's another guy who's, I'm sorry to say, whose name just is eluding me right now. So I'd recommend checking out his books, and also I'd pour out some Henny for you, Paresh. He wrote some cool stuff. And hopefully this is cool as well. Don't make me look like a jackass by saying your writing's excellent and then it not be. Anyway, so yeah, I'll start reading now and stop doing what I'm doing. I'm also sick, so yeah, I said that already. Now it seems forced, doesn't it? Because I said I was sick and then I coughed. Psychosomatic, maybe? Anyway, with the collapse of the so-called, quote, communist regimes in Eastern Europe and the former USSR, Marx himself has been called into question by many, including radicals. In the ensuing article, I attempt to present a coherent picture of Marx's socialism, specifically its economic content, by going back to his original texts. In light of Marx's ideas, I next examine the socialist project of the founder of what became the Soviet system, where I consider the latter's socialism as a purely theoretical economic category, abstracting from his concrete practice. It should be emphasized that this essay focuses solely on a theoretical level, and is not at all concerned with how Marx's views might guide his followers in the establishment of the new society. Get some water real quick. Introduction and general overview. All right. For Marx, communism or socialism, parenthesis, communism and socialism are equivalent in Marx, end parenthesis, is a society of free and associated labor passing through at least two successive phases. The self-emancipation of the proletariat, and thereby the proletariat's self-liquidation as proletariat. So there you go, moist stones, not the only person who draws attention to this self-abolition of the proletariat as proletariat, in distinction to the so-called realization of the proletariat, which what people like Stone call traditional Marxism, how people traditionally in the camp of traditional Marxism, which I would say that Lenin is part of, usually consider it as a realization of the proletariat, not its self-abolition. Anyway. Oh shit, dude, I see the word free association. I'm gonna freak out. Sorry. The self-emancipation of the proletariat, and thereby its self-liquidation as proletariat, is a prolonged process starting with the establishment of its political rule and passing through a whole transformation period, changing circumstances and individuals in preparation for the future. Free association. Ew. In the new society based on directly social labor, neither the allocation of labor, time, nor the distribution of products of labor in society is mediated by money commodity form. Corresponding to the new social relations of production, the property relations of the old society are transformed into direct collective appropriation of the means of production by society, unmediated by the state, which ceases to exist. The distribution of the consumable part of the total social product among the individuals of the new society is, again, affected by society itself, unmediated by the wage form of remuneration, labor power having ceased to exist as a commodity, in proportion to the individual's labor contribution to the total social labor, at least in the first phase of the association. Lenin, unlike Marx, distinguishes socialism from communism, identifying them, respectively, with Marx's first and the second phase of the future society. Lenin conceives the socialist economy in terms of social ownership of the means of production, which, unlike Marx again, Lenin identifies with the ownership of the (working class) and (state). Regarding exchange relations, Lenin broadly follows Marx in excluding commodities from socialism. As to the distribution of the means of consumption, Lenin, while accepting the Marxian principle of the first phase of communism, introduces two elements absent in Marx, namely the state as enforcer of the still existing, quote, bourgeois right, end quote, and the wage form of labor remuneration for the citizens, supposed to be hired employees of the state. In sum, Lenin's public ownership socialism is closer to the Second International Socialism than to Marx's first phase of communism. Though I examine Lenin's socialism below, the basis of the post-Lenin communist ideology, in light of Marx's own socialism, viewed as a free union of producers with the conditions of production excluding private property in the means of production, commodity relations, and wage labor along with the state, all symbols of human alienation, appear to us to be the most thoroughgoing and self-consistent project of social emancipation, and hence also worth studying as such. Marx. Even though Marx did not leave any, quote, blueprint, end quote, for socialism, he left enough material for us to have a fair idea of the society that he thought would succeed capitalism. I first start with his ideas on the transition to socialism as a prelude to our discussion of his ideas on the socialist economy. Transition to socialism. It is well known that contrary to other socialists, particularly the anarchists, Marx underlines the necessity of a transition period between capitalism and socialism. In Marx's discussion of this question, two basic points must be grasped. First, socialism is not the transition between capitalism and communism, and, secondly, there is no specific, quote, transitional society, end quote, as such between the two. There is only the transitional period, during which the old society itself is being transformed into the new. The starting point here is that, contrary to widespread belief, Marx makes no distinction between socialism and communism. For Marx, they are the alternative terms for the same kind of society, for which he also uses other alternative terms, such as, quote, association, quote, union, quote, society of producers, end quote, etc. It is the same society that passes through a, quote, lower and a, quote, higher phase. It is Lenin who first seems to have distinguished, in 1917, between socialism and communism. The Leninist position has mostly been accepted as Marx's own. One consequence has been the false assumption that socialism is the transition to communism, as expressed by Samueli, 1974, Bertil Ullmann, 1978, Paul Sweezy, 1980, Nova, I think it's Alexander Nova, 1983, and Ralph Miliband, 1991. Now socialism, even when considered, a la Lenin, as Marx's first phase of communism, is obviously already the new society and cannot be the transition to the same society. Indeed, Marx's transition period refers to the one preceding the first phase of communism. To confuse Marx's transition even with this first phase, where the producers have ceased to be proletarians, would imply the evaporation of the prolonged process of the producer's self-emancipation and Marx's metamorphosis into a Bakunin. Secondly, in Marx, there is no specific transitional society, based on a specific transitional mode of production interposed between capitalism and socialism or communism. Significantly, Marx speaks instead of a political transition period, during which capitalist society is being transformed in a revolutionary way into its opposite, socialism. Marx envisages only one society that succeeds capitalism. This, quote, non-capitalist society, end quote, as Marx calls it, is simply what he designates a, quote, communist society, or the, quote, socialist constitution of mankind, end quote, Marx. Corresponding to this society, there is a new mode of production which Marx calls, quote, the associated mode of production, end quote. Marx indeed specifically mentions the capitalist mode of production itself as the transition to the associated mode of production. This affirmation should not be surprising to any careful reader of Marx's texts, for it follows from the nature of the proletarian revolution itself as envisaged by him. First, it is capitalism that creates the material conditions for capitalism's own destruction, as well as the material conditions for the creation of the new society, both by capitalism's tendency towards universal development of the productive forces and by the socialization of labor and production. However, capital, understood as a relation hereafter, is not revolutionized within capitalism itself automatically. It is the conscious task of capitalism's, quote, gravediggers, end quote, to eliminate capital. And here comes the specificity of the proletarian revolution. Unlike the bourgeoisie, who started to undermine the pre-capitalist production relations and subsume labor long before attaining the state power, the proletariat must first have its own political power in order to start the transformation process. From this point onward starts the process of revolutionizing the bourgeois mode of production. It continues till the whole mode of production is revolutionized. This is the profound meaning of Marx's, quote, revolutionary transformation period, end quote, dominated by proletarian rule. Marx never assumes that the bourgeois mode of production vanishes on the morrow of the installation of the working class state, nor even that the whole process could have a relatively short duration. This is clear particularly in his well-known writings on the Paris Commune of 1871, as well as in his polemic with Bakunin 4 years later. In a somewhat cryptic way, though, the whole idea is encapsulated in Marx's characterization of the transition period as the, quote, prolonged birth pangs, end quote, within the womb of the old society. The collective appropriation of the conditions of production by the producers themselves, which alone can usher in the free association by terminating the proletarian rule, is thus a long-drawn historical process. While the juridical elimination of individual private property and the means of production, along with their centralization in the hands of a proletarian state, is indispensable for expropriating the bourgeoisie, it does not by itself signify collective appropriation by society, and does not indicate the end of capital. It is only the beginning measure toward that end, and until capital disappears, the producers, even though undergoing transformation, do not cease to be proletarian. Consequently, the proletarian rule continues during the whole transition period, the period of preparation for workers' self-emancipation. Socialist relations of production. For Marx, it should be stressed, the self-emancipation of the proletariat would automatically imply human emancipation in general, because in capitalism, the last antagonistic social formation in humanity's, quote, prehistory, end quote, there is no class below the proletariat. Perfectly in accord with this emancipatory premise, the economic social formation succeeding capitalism is based on a completely new mode of production, the associated mode of production. And the new formation itself is often designated as, quote, association or, quote, union. This association, identical with socialism or communism, along with the corresponding associated mode of production, which has a profoundly emancipatory meaning in Marx, would later rarely be referred to as such, and in fact would be obscured by the ritualistic use of the term, quote, socialism, end quote, by most of those who had claimed to be Marx's followers. Union or association, this context has a double sense. It signifies a voluntary, unmediated union of individuals who are all producers, having ceased to be proletarians, and it is based, secondly, on the union, again unconstrained and unmediated, between the producers and the conditions of production, their own creation. This union thus constitutes a double negation of the individual's alienation from the other individuals in society as well as from oneself, through the alienation from one's own product. This union, the exact opposite of capitalism's separation, is, however, not the restitution of the earlier union in either of its versions, either constrained as in slavery/serfdom or voluntary as either in, quote, natural communism, end quote, or in small family enterprises, inasmuch as neither of them is apt for developing labor as social labor or for developing the productive forces of labor. Toward this end, society had to go through a process of separation between the producers and the conditions of production, which alone allowed, through antagonism, both the socialization of labor and the universal development of the productive forces. Thus, the new union is built on the basis of the acquisition of the capital era. In this profoundly dialectical sense, capitalism itself is the transition to socialism. The individuals in the association are free, in the sense that in the relations of production there is no longer any, quote, personal dependence, end quote, as in pre-capitalism, nor any, quote, material dependence, end quote, as in capitalism. After the laborers cease to be proletarians, labor loses its earlier meaning. Labor is no longer an occupational job for the purpose of providing subsistence, but is transformed into a free and conscious activity toward the development of the individual's human essence. Thus, in these new social relations of production, we have the complete de-alienation of the individuals from both their own kind and their own material creations. As opposed to the hitherto existing, quote, false, end quote, community, which was an abstraction, an autonomous power confronting and subjecting the singular individual, there is now a, quote, true, end quote, community, whose members are universally developed, quote, social individuals, end quote, subjecting their relations to their own control. Quite appropriately, Marx considers socialism as inaugurating humanity's history, with humanity's, quote, prehistory, end quote, left behind. Property relations. In contrast with the great length at which he discusses earlier property relations, Marx, refusing to indulge in, quote, utopian, end quote, projects, says more about the transgression of those earlier relations in the new society than about what specific forms the new relations will assume. With the transformation of the social relations of production, the relations of property in the means of production are also transformed, arising as they do from the relations of production. Property relations are simply the legal expression of the social relations of production. There has been a lot of confusion on the question of property relations in the association. The dominant trend, the Marxist, beginning with the Second International, has been to interpret capitalist, quote, private property, end quote, in the means of production in terms of individual private property, occasionally including corporate property, and to equate its juridical elimination with the establishment of what is usually called, quote, socialist property, and thereby with the abolition of capitalism itself. Before we proceed further, a small detour on this question may not be out of place. In Marx, private property and the means of production has two meanings. In the first and fundamental sense, the means of production are private property when a part of society has a monopoly over them. In other words, these are class property. Capitalism is not different from other class societies in this regard. But here the means of production, class, private property, are capital by virtue of their separation from the immediate producers. Given this separation, it is the, quote, non-property, end quote, or, quote, alien property, end quote, of the wage laborers in the means of production that makes the means of production capitalist private property in the fundamental class sense. Private property in the means of production in its second sense, on the other hand, refers to the common usage, that is, property of private individuals as opposed to collective property. Within the context of this second sense, Marx shows that the private property of the capitalists, arising out of the ruins of the private property of the independent petty producers, ultimately becomes self-destructive. At a particular stage of capital accumulation, capitalist property ceases to be private property of the capitalists, individually speaking, and becomes collective capitalist property, thereby assuming a, quote, directly social, end quote, character, without, however, abolishing capitalism. As the last limit of centralization of capital, Marx even envisages the existence, over the whole economy, of a single capital, under a single ownership, excluding obviously the existence of separate private capitals. Though capitalist private property, in its second Marxian sense, changes its forms corresponding to the exigencies of capital accumulation, Capitalist private property as class property is necessarily invariant with the existence of capital itself. Thus, whereas the juridical elimination of individual capitalist private property is perfectly possible within capitalism, the quote, invisible, end quote, class property in capital cannot be abolished juridically, as that would be tantamount to abolishing bourgeois production relations, whose juridical expression is this property, by mere legal enactments. Capitalist ownership over the means of production is eliminated only with the elimination of capitalist production relations. Ownership over the conditions of production in socialism is, of course, collective, at the level of society. In the new society, naturally, there is no private ownership over the conditions of production. Indeed, one of the, quote, beginning measures, end quote, of the proletarian power, as we noted earlier, is the juridical elimination of individual capitalist property. However, inasmuch as the installation of proletarian power does not mean immediate, quote, victory of socialism, end quote, in the same way, proletarian statization of the means of production does not ipso facto mean, quote, social ownership, end quote, of the conditions of production. It is the revolutionization of the bourgeois production relations. One second. Excuse me. It is the revolution of the bourgeois production relations that determines the revolutionization of the bourgeois ownership relations and the establishment of, quote, social ownership, end quote, over the conditions of production in the new society. Even though capitalist property arose out of the ruins of the property of the independent producers, the, quote, expropriation of the expropriators, end quote, does not mean a return to the private property of the individual producers. The expropriation of the expropriators establishes not private property, but individual property, which arises from what Marx calls, quote, positive abolition, bracket, sublimation, end bracket, end quote, of private property in the means of production. Individual property signifies here the real self-appropriation of human essence by the individual who is now a universally developed social individual. It is the social individual's self-affirmation, a conscious return to one's own human essence. And this is possible only in a, quote, true, end quote, that is, non-alienated community. This, quote, individual property, end quote, here signifies appropriation of the creation of production by the social individual. Whereas all the earlier forms of appropriation had naturally a limited character, social appropriation by the producers themselves, or appropriation by the social individual, has a universal total character. This is so first because of the total character of deprivation of the producers in the old society, and second because the development of the productive forces which are now appropriated has already reached a universal character. In an antagonistic form, though, under capitalism and can be appropriated, non-antagonistically, only collectively, only by society of the free producers. Thereby the individual develops into a, quote, total individual, end quote. Just as private property and the conditions of production characterizes humanity's, quote, prehistory, end quote, at different stages, of which capitalism is the last. In the same way, individual property, in this unusually rich sense, will characterize humanity's, quote, history, end quote. Exchange relations. Like the ownership relations, Exchange relations also undergo transformation corresponding to the transformation of the social relations of production. As in earlier societies, both the material exchange of individuals with nature and the social exchange among themselves continue to operate in socialism. However, in each case there is a profound transformation corresponding to the transformed relations of production. As to the material exchanges of individuals with nature, while the capitalist mode of production, compared with the earlier modes of production, renders human beings less dependent on the power of nature by progressively subjecting these powers to human intelligence through an unprecedented increase in the material forces of production. Its technology, at the same time, seriously damages the natural environment by undermining the natural powers of the earth along with those of the human producer, the twin fountains of all wealth. Under the associated mode of production, in contrast with the earlier modes, the social individuals not only free themselves from subjugation by nature's blind forces through a rational regulation of their material exchanges with nature, but also carry on these exchanges in conditions most worthy of and in fullest conformity with their human nature. Turning to the exchange relations among individuals, all exchange of labor either regulated hierarchically, as in pre-capitalism, or through generalized value form, including exchange of objectified labor against objectified labor, as well as that of objectified labor against living labor, ceases under the associated mode of production. Instead, there is now, quote, free exchange, end quote, among the social individuals, that is, exchange of their activities, determined by their collective needs and aims on the basis of the social appropriation and control of the conditions of production. In other words, exchange of labor under the new conditions takes the form of unmediated exchange of activities among the associated producers. In the de-alienated society, there is no need for the products of individual labor to go through exchange in order to be what the products of individual labor really are, that is, social. Individual labor is, by definition, directly social right from the start. Here, social relations of production naturally cease to present themselves as things, independent of the producers, and cease to take an inverted, mystified form. That is why, according to Marx, even at the, quote, first phase, end quote, of socialism or communism, based on the associated mode of production, commodity production goes out of existence. Thus, after conceiving of socialism as a society of free and associated producers, Marx is perfectly logical in supposing that such a society excludes commodity production based, as he maintains, on, quote, universal alienation, end quote, just as he is perfectly consistent in excluding from the association other alienating categories of like private property, wage remuneration, and the state. Distribution relations and planning. Distribution, in an economic sense in any society, can be viewed as the distribution both of conditions of production and of products where the first distribution determines the second. The distribution of the conditions of production, again, includes distribution of instruments of production and distribution of the laboring members of society among different spheres of production. The distribution of the conditions of production is in fact the distribution of the total social labor time, dead and living, across the economy. Thus viewed, the distribution of the conditions of production is a, quote, moment, end quote, of production itself, or an aspect of the mode of production itself. We discuss first the distribution of production conditions, that is labor time, and then that of products. Social labor time refers to society's time available for production. The regulation of production by a proper distribution of society's available labor time among different productive spheres is common to all societies. On the other hand, another issue, equally general, concerns the absolute magnitude of society's available labor time itself. There is a need for economizing society's global time for production, not only indicating greater productive efficiency, but also in order to release more time for the disposal of society's individuals for their enjoyment and development. Thus, all economy is finally reduced to the economy of time. However, though the economy of time and its distribution in society are affected in different ways in different societies, in a society based on collective production, they assume such a different character that they constitute, quote, the first economic law, end quote, in such a society, says Marx. The interbranch allocation of society's labor time is a question of the latter's alternative uses in suitable proportions. For more time is bestowed on some branches of production while less time remains for the rest. This allocation problem, common to all societies, is solved differently in different societies. Thus, whereas under capitalism the distribution of society's labor time is mediated by the value form of products of labor, the new society solves the problem in in a conscious planned way, without the need for social relations to appear as relations between things. Within the broad context of society's allocation of society's available labor time, there are, again, two particular situations that all economies face. The first concerns the replacement of the means of production that perish or wear out in the course of time. Given the fluctuation in the volume of durable parts of the means of production, as a function of changing consumption needs, and the need for maintaining a corresponding level of volume of raw materials and semi-finished products, the problem is how to affect the reproduction of the means of production in their totality. Whereas capitalism, quote, solves, end quote, this problem anarchically, the real solution lies in, quote, continuous relative overproduction, end quote, of the means of production, possible only when society consciously controls and plans the process of its own reproduction, as in socialism. I don't know. I think I was listening to one of the. If you don't listen to it, there's a good podcast slash YouTube channel. That's how I listen to it. I mean, I guess it's on other things too. This is a YouTube channel called Future Histories or something like that. And there's this kind of, and I think I was listening to one by Jasper Burns, and he was saying something about to the effect that like a lot of conceptions of socialism think of their economies as like taught, like they think of them as um kind of like bare minimum, kind of like no wiggle room at all that would allow for freedom of movement of people or anything like that. It's kind of like this has to be here or there in this exact precise amount in order to reproduce society at all. And I think this passage here made me think of that because I haven't really thought of I don't know, for some reason I guess I should think more. I should probably think more as a person and more as in terms of like my research and stuff like that about this kind of concept of like quote continuous relative overproduction, end quote, under socialism. Planned overproduction that doesn't cause periodic crisis. Anyway, back to the text. The second problem concerns the temporal lag between employment of resources and obtaining use values therefrom. This lag is naturally longer in some lines of production, shorter in others. This, again, is a situation independent of any specific mode of production. The problem of allocating resources to the production lines with a longer temporal lag, compared with others with a shorter lag, without affecting the latter, is, quote, solved, end quote, in capitalism post festum, and at the cost of abiding disturbances. Whereas under the associated mode of production, society would consciously calculate and plan in advance of the necessary scale, in advance, the necessary scale of operation and allocate the resources, that is, the total labor time, accordingly. Marx observes that from a purely objective point of view, the necessity of such calculation increases with the growing social character of production. For example, in capitalism compared with simple commodity production. Given the supposition that socialism is at a still higher scale of socialization, and that it is a consciously planned society, the necessity of such calculation, social, quote, bookkeeping, end quote, is naturally even greater in the associated mode of production compared to any earlier mode of production. This is an important point. I just read, I haven't put it up on the YouTube channel yet, and I don't know what goes up first, but the the paper of it's a paper called "The Myth of Council Communism's Proudhonism," and it's this idea that because it's a critique of Gilles Daudet, who in a paper in his various works, and one of the first Marxists I read was Gilles Daudet because I got interested in Marxism from being around like communization-y kind of I don't know, Alphabin was a big initiator, and so was EndNotes. And people like in EndNotes and in Gilles Daudet and all these people largely associated with what you'd call communization theory, have this idea that a post-capitalist society would somehow step away from labor calculation at all, some type of allocation of coordination of labor times in specific sites of production would still be necessary in a socialist civilization. And they say, no, that's not the case. So that article that I'm talking about was a critique of that kind of perspective, and it seems like there's, Paresh Chattopadhyay would also disagree with that perspective, because he says here, the necessity of such calculation, social, quote, bookkeeping, end quote, is naturally even greater in the associated mode of production compared to any earlier mode of production. So if you find this article interesting, or find that critique of communization theory, at least as represented by Gilles Daudet, interesting, then I recommend you check out that lecture by David Adam. And this is kind of like one of those things where it's like I obviously am really interested in the Frankfurt School oriented people that are associated with things like open Marxism and Neue Marxlektura, and people like that, and I can't speak about all of them. I can't speak without sleeping generalizations, but like they critique visions of socialism that view the alternative to capitalism as a, quote, new labor economy. For instance, Werner Bonefeld uses that term all the time. But I think that the people that are, critical of Leninist conceptions of Marxism need to kind of like not be so phobic towards conceptions of concrete alternatives, or semi-concrete, at least in terms of you can't be that concrete about the future, but people that have really tried to explore what are like the necessary features of a non-capitalist yet emancipatory economy. And I think that we need to look back to people like Anton Pannekoek, the GIC, the Group of International Communists from Holland, and folks like that who tried to give a conception, who wrote the Group of International Communists from Holland, uh, wrote the book, The Fundamental Principles of Communist Production and Distribution, and obviously Anton Pannekoek wrote the book Workers' Councils. And I think that we need to like go back to those kinds of people who don't kind of like uh, reject speculation about the future. And when they do venture to speculate about the future, they don't make unrealistic assertions about the nature of socialism being bereft of bookkeeping and accounting, which is like that's a dead end. Um, so I think in other places, Paresh Chattopadhyay uh, says that some helpful hints um, towards realizing, towards conceptualizing a socialist alternative can be found in looking at Anton Pannekoek and also Otto Neurath, who I know people from EndNotes or affiliated with EndNotes, like uh, I think I can't pronounce his name. It's Aaron Benanov. Um, and I believe Jasper Burns too, to some extent, has also done this, but have looked back at Otto Neurath, who's associated with the what's it called, the logical empiricists or logical positivism, but was a put forward a lot of ideas about um, the possibility of a global in-kind economy, meaning moneyless economy, exchangeless economy, and so Paresh has kind of said like we should look at Pannekoek and we should look at Otto Neurath. And I know nothing about Otto Neurath except for that little spiel I just gave you. But I think that's more promising than saying these kind of like wild things about, these wild, like romantic, like absolutist things about that no one literally, that is just like throws the baby out with the bathwater in terms of like rejecting some kind of like authoritarian uh, planned economy from above. Um, Obviously, we should reject that as well. But we need to. I feel like if you're a libertarian communist or something related to that, you need to have a conception about um, what that alternative substantially means. And other people have said this, like said things like this, like like Michael Heinrich says, like one of the weakest parts of like the left concurrently, at least in some of his talks, has been like the absence of a substantial utopia or vision that they can present to people, and instead these kind of like reactionary, kind of like folkish social democratic visions that are kind of like prominent among like populists and nationalist populists, um, are really speaking to people. And part of the reason they're speaking to people is because that's in some sense the only game in town. And then Lauren Goldner, I think in one of these pieces for Insurgent Notes, says something to the effect is like, okay, like if capitalism is overthrown, if there's a generalized world insurrectionary situation that makes a possibility of overcoming capitalism possible, if we are still dependent upon you know uh, gasoline, for instance, to coordinate the economy to get uh, goods and services from point A to point B. However, we organize how those goods and services, whether we do like if we're doing it in a in kind way, in a non-monetary, um, non-value oriented way, it's still going to require um, very very complicated uh, ideas about how we get gasoline from one part of the world or one locale to another. And then you could say, well, we don't want gasoline. It's like, okay, well, you need some other way of distributing goods on a mass scale and empowering the vehicles and stuff, which I'm not in a position to say anything on. But just say that, like, within like the libertarian communist like uh, world, it seems like there's there's certain people who really like want to get serious about talking about like what alternatives mean, and then there's other people that just kind of poo-poo the idea. And I think that we should reject poo-pooing the idea and not just focus on insurgency and alienation in under under capitalist conditions, but we also need to consider, what is an actual alternative. And I think Paresh Chattopadhyay has made some good recommendations for how we conceive of that, as well as people who are such as that are more like in the academic world. Like I read the book Visions of Council Democracy, which I think was a very nice contribution to questions of how you substantially organize an autonomous, i.e., self-ruling, self-managed society. Not in the sense of like self-ruling, like separate autonomy in the sense of like absolute separations between people or workplaces or something like that. Some kind of like straw man that people make against fucking self-management conceptions of socialism. But trying to articulate the way that people have tried to conceptualize what an emancipatory vision of socialism based on council democracy could has theoretically been discussed by people such as Castoriadis and Lafleur. And I think that's part of the reason I'm trying to I'm not settled upon it, but I think I'm a graduate student, and I'm in the history program. And I want to write about Castoriadis because I think that his critiques of, whatever their limitations are, and obviously you'd have to explore the limitations. You can't just write a hagiography of someone like that. But I think the notion that the critique of the USSR and other such quasi-alternatives to capitalism brings into stark, prompts one to say, well, what the hell is socialism? And I think that his writings in the 3 essays on the content of socialism and elsewhere in the pages of Socialism ou Barbarie are something very important to think about. Yeah. Sorry, I was just rambling on there, but maybe this flu or COVID or cold or whatever is making me delirious, and I just feel the need to ramble. Anyway, back to the text after that. I don't even know how long I was talking there. Not only is the allocation of labor time as between different lines of production affected in a different way under the associated mode of production, compared with capitalism, the saving of society's global time itself, devoted to material production, takes on a different character in the new society. The creation of disposable time by minimizing the global labor time signifies, for all class societies, non-labor time for the non-producing few. However, unlike all earlier modes of production, capitalism continuously strives to increase beyond the necessary labor time of the producers their surplus labor time, the appropriation of which as surplus value is considered the society's wealth, given exchange value and not use value as its objective. Surplus labor is the labor of the worker beyond her/his own needs. This, in fact, is labor for society, which under capitalism, the capitalist appropriates in the name of society. This surplus labor is the basis of society's free time and simultaneously the material basis of society's many-sided development. However, since capitalism, on the other hand, creates disposable time, while on the other hand it converts this disposable time into surplus labor time, leading ultimately to the crisis of overproduction and non-valorization of surplus labor, the process is contradictory. The contradiction is overcome in the associated mode of production. First of all, in the conditions of social appropriation of conditions of production, the earlier distinction between necessary and surplus labor time loses its meaning. From now on, necessary labor time will be measured in terms of needs of the, quote, social individual, end quote, not in terms of needs of valorization. Similarly, increases in disposable time will no longer signify non-labor time for the few. It is disposable or free time, beyond labor time, for all, quote, social individuals, end quote. It is now society's free time and no longer labor time that becomes the measure of society's wealth. And this in a double sense. First, its increase indicates that labor time produces more and more wealth due to immense increases in productive forces, unconstrained by earlier contradictions. The wealth toward the enrichment of all, quote, social individuals, end quote. Secondly, free time itself signifies wealth in an unusual sense, because it means the enjoyment of different kinds of creation and because it means free activity, which unlike labor time is not determined by any external finality, that has to be satisfied either as a natural necessity or as a social obligation. On the other hand, labor time itself, the basis of free time, takes on a new meaning. Labor now is directly social, unmediated hierarchically or by the value form of its products, and, bereft of its earlier antagonistic character, has a completely new quality compared with the one that is shown by the, quote, beast of labor, end quote. It is now truly social labor. Finally, is now truly social labor. Excuse me. However, the time of labor, given its determination by external finality, remains within the realm of necessity. The time of labor does not belong to the kingdom of liberty, which lies beyond the sphere of material production and hence is accessible only by going beyond the labor time, that is, by free time. Of course, as Marx observes, the kingdom of liberty can develop only on the basis of the kingdom of necessity. We now turn to another important aspect of distribution under socialism, that concerning the division of social product between society's production needs and consumption needs, as well as the distribution of the means of consumption among the, quote, social individuals, end quote. As to the first problem, one part of the social product serves as common funds that include replacement and extension of the means of production as well as society's insurance and reserve funds against uncertainty. The rest serves as means of collective consumption, mainly society's health and educational needs, the provision for those unable to work, and personal consumption. As to the mode of distribution of the means of consumption among individual producers, this wholly follows from the way in which the conditions of production are distributed. As producers are united with the conditions of production in socialism, they are, to start with, no longer sellers of their labor power, and the wage form of return to their labor ceases right from the, quote, first phase, end quote, of the new society. Here the laborers receive from their own free association, I'm not going to sing this time, not wage but some kind of a token, indicating the labor time contributed by them, individually, to the social labor time, after deduction for common funds. These tokens allow the laborers to draw from the social stock of means of consumption, the amount costing the same amount of labor. Naturally, in the absence of commodity production, these tokens are not money. They do not circulate. In the first phase of the union, the right of the capital U in that union, the right of the individual producers to receive consumption goods, proportional to the labor contributed by the individual producers, after necessary deduction, is a, quote, equal right, end quote, in the sense that the measurement involved is done with a, quote, equal standard, end quote, labor, though the equal right is, at the same time, quote, unequal, given the unequal contribution of the individual producer. insofar as a given amount of labor in one form is exchanged for an equal amount of labor in another form, the principle involved here is the same as that which prevails under commodity production, even though products have ceased to take commodity form. The determining principle of distribution among individuals being each one's labor contribution, following the commodity equivalence method, and not yet human needs. This unequal right is thus still within the bourgeois horizon. It is a, quote, bourgeois right, end quote. The latter is fully overcome only in a higher phase of society. And you can think of like, I don't know, well, this is just me talking again. It seems like you can think of all different ways that kind of like, those different principles from, from each according to their ability to each according to their work. Maybe I'm saying the first part of that phrase wrong, but the type of lower phase of communism and socialism in Marx, or what Bakunin, or what the anarchist communists refer to as Bakunin's collectivism, which is the same kind of thing, distribution according to labor, directly proportional to labor input, and from each according to their ability to each according to their needs. It seems like between those like two different types of principles that would rule that would guide distribution under a communist or socialist mode of production, those different things, those different principles can be applied. It seems to me, at least, this is not me talking, putting words in Chattopadhyay's mouth, but it seems like you could have something where and even you see this now is like people, if you think of like maybe like I don't know, if you think of like services free at the point of use, say like, I don't know, at least like the conception of what the NHS in England is supposed to be, like free at the point of use healthcare. That would be an example of that type of thinking would be an instance of to each according to their need, while simultaneously in other aspect features of life, individual consumption could still be guided by this kind of this labor time accounting, quid pro quo kind of situation. So it seems like between an absolutely communist, from each according to their ability to each according to their need, and the collectivist or lower phase of communism conception of from each according to their ability to each according to their work, between A and B, there seems like there could be different configurations of that, while keep preventing wealth from taking the form of money and commodity and capital, obviously. So that's something to think about. And it feels like for me, it's like, okay, like these aren't distinct phases. There isn't like there, or maybe they are distinct phases, but like, just as if you think of, for example, absolute surplus value production and relative surplus production, in a certain sense, there's you can speak of them in a kind of like chronological, historical sense, as one being dominant and then another being dominant later. But it doesn't seem like ever within a capitalist economy, especially if you think about like agricultural improvements in like the pre-industrial period, that increases in labor productivity based upon, say, the increase of labor productivity, for example, in agriculture, the so-called improvements to agriculture that took place with the marketization of agriculture in early modern England. Like those, the strict distinction between absolute surplus value production and relative surplus value production doesn't seem like, to me, can be like sustained as like distinct phases. So maybe you could think, maybe, I don't know, maybe you could kind of think of like the idea of versus of like the lower phase and the higher phase as something like that. Like you could have aspects of a communist civil or a higher level communist civilization fairly early. and I think this is what a lot of people have said. I think this is what kind of like anarchist communists kind of say is like we could have distribution according to need relatively fast after uh, the producers insurgency. Um, so yeah, that's just something to think about for me at least is thinking about how these principles, these two different principles, could both contradict but also complement each other at different points in a hypothetical post-capitalist society. Anyway, um, on to Lenin. The section's called Lenin. Socialism as the future society rarely appears as a theoretical category in Lenin's writings before 1917. Lenin's image of socialism is increasingly laid bare, starting a few months before the seizure of power. His discussion of socialism as a pure theoretical category is developed in, and in fact mostly confined, to his State and Revolution, a work that remained unfinished. Lenin's preoccupation in the post-October period was with the concrete problem of constructing what he conceived as a socialist society, with the problem of transition to what according to him is a socialist economy, from a backward semi-capitalist economy in a hostile international environment. However, from time to time, theoretical formulations on socialism do appear in his post-October writings, devoted to the concrete problems of socialist construction. In any event, Lenin's treatment of the socialist economy as a theoretical category is much less elaborate compared to his treatment of the other dimensions of revolutionary theory and practice. Secondly, Lenin's socialism lacks the many-sidedness of Marx's socialism. Marx's continuous preoccupation with the problem of development of the de-alienated social individuals, based on the producer's self-emancipation, does not find such much an echo in Lenin. For example, one would look in vain for a discussion in Lenin of the allocation of society's labor time and the dialectics of society's disposable time, which occupies an important place in Marx's elaboration on the development of social individuals. Hence, the framework of Lenin's socialism is substantially narrower than Marx. Me again. One thing to consider, maybe, potentially, and I don't know if this is I don't know what text in particular Chattopadhyay is referring to here, but one could consider, one should always keep in mind that some of the key texts of Marx's collected works were not available to every generation of post-Marx Marxists. And that's something that Michael Heinrich emphasizes, which is like, Lenin and Luxemburg didn't have Grundrisse, and they didn't have the 1844 manuscripts, which to my mind would be like the main text in which people talk about, these kind of more like higher humanist emancipatory conceptions of what socialism could provide for social individuals. I'm not sure if that's, maybe I'm completely off base here, but it seems like that is something to consider. Yeah. Here, but maybe that's not what, maybe, I'm not a Marxologist in the, elaborate sense. I've read the 3 volumes, I've read one of the volume, the 1863 to 65 or 1864 to 65 manuscripts that are the basis for volume 3. I've read Grundrisse. I've never read Theories of Surplus Value, so there you are. If you're not as far as long as me on your Marxology journey, then don't feel bad, because I've never read what a lot of people would consider like crucial text within that project that one would have to be familiar with. But I read a pretty decent amount of substantial secondary literature on all those books I just mentioned. So what I'm saying, the reason I'm saying about what I know about Marxism, the texts that were available to Lenin at this time. I don't know what text Chattopadhyay is particularly referring to, but if he's referring to the Grundrisse and to the 1844 manuscripts, where Marx's humanism is probably most directly on display, even if it continues throughout his life. You can kind of, at least you can kind of sort of give you can sort of give Lenin a break to a certain extent. That's why I think figures like William Morris are actually really unique individuals, because like he was defining like a very elaborate critique of like how the firsthand experience of production was an alienating process, and that there's a degradation of craft under capitalism in a very pretty fairly elaborate way, in absence from like any direct experience with these earlier texts of Marxism. So I think he's kind of like, in a certain sense, a pioneer. And obviously you'll see that in other left-wing artistic types saying similar things. But anyway, back to the text. Socialism as public ownership. Lenin distinguishes socialism from communism, equating them respectively with Marx's first and second phase. He also speaks of two transitions, one from capitalism to socialism, another from socialism to communism. Secondly, Lenin conceives of socialism basically in terms of property relations rather than relations of production. For Lenin, socialism is, quote, social ownership, end quote, in the means of production, and social ownership is taken to be the equivalent of the abolition of, quote, private ownership, end quote. The latter ownership, again, is defined as ownership by, quote, separate persons, end quote. Lenin further specifies that social ownership of the means of production signifies the ownership of the means of production by the working class state. Now, Lenin's two, quote, transition, end quote, propositions concerning the future society, nowhere used by Marx, tends to obscure the specificity of what Marx called the, quote, political transition period, end quote, leading to the socialist society. The passage from the capitalist society to the first phase of communism is qualitatively different from the passage from the first to the second phase of communism, inasmuch as the former involves a revolution in the social relations of production, whereas the latter does not. There is no new social formation in the second phase because the mode of production already revolutionized to form the basis of the first phase, the associated mode of production, continues in the second phase. The two phases do not have separate modes of production. It is not without reason that Marx reserves the phrase, quote, revolutionary transformation period, end quote, only for the first passage referred to here and not for the second. In the same way, Lenin's corresponding distinction between socialism and communism, it should be stressed, tends to obfuscate the basic Marxian point that the first phase of communism is already the beginning of the society of free and associated producers, a de-alienated, emancipated society. Secondly, Lenin's concept of socialism as such considerably impoverishes its emancipatory connotation in Marx. Not clearly envisaging it as an ensemble of new social relations of production constituting a free association, Lenin reduces socialism to a specific property form, namely, working class state ownership of the means of production through the elimination of individual private ownership, calling it, quote, social ownership, end quote, of the means of production. this is just a side note. This is also this is important because this is, for my purposes, in terms of my research interests, this is important because this type of conception of socialism is what fundamentally leads Leon Trotsky to describe the Stalinist USSR as fundamentally still socialist in terms of production, even if the bureaucracy is undemocratic and scrapes extra for itself at the top in a kind of parasitic way, not like a structural way. So it's still socialist because the means of production are nationalized. And this is something that's going to be critiqued by a lot of people. Castoriadis, who I'm most familiar with, is going to basically criticize Trotsky, and if he was of Proudhonism, for assessing the social content of a society based upon its legal forms, and more or less ascribing basically saying that Trotsky and this type of conception of socialism just being the nationalization of the means of production is a legalistic formalism in terms of how socialism is being conceived, and any substantial analysis of the relations between direct producers and the social world in which they produce will see that this is an extremely exploitative, alienated, highly undemocratic system beyond a glimmer of reformability. That would be the people who work with the degenerated worker state thesis will say. And I'm not as much of I'm more of an expert on what Castoriadis has to say because I've read more of him, but I think that the third camp Trotskyists kind of say a similar thing. Although they never come to a state capitalist conception of the USSR, at least in the mainstream of third camp Trotskyism. So that would be kind of an interesting thing for someone to research, maybe myself, is about like the theoretical relationship between third camp Trotskyist conceptions of the USSR in the early 1940s and on, and the state capitalist conceptions that would emerge out of the Trotskyist movement, represented by people like Castoriadis, Claude Lefort, C.L.R. James, Raya Dunayevskaya. That would kind of be a very interesting project that I should probably consider engaging in. Especially because a lot of the texts are in English, and I'm not bilingual, if you've noticed. I can't pronounce shit right. Anyway. Let me see. Where the hell am I? Let me get back to the text. Not clearly envisaging it as an ensemble of new social relations of production constituting a free association, Lenin reduces socialism to a specific property form, namely working-class state ownership of the means of production through the elimination of individual private property, calling it, quote, social ownership, end quote, of the means of production. We saw earlier that, according to Marx, individual private property in the means of production tends to be superseded at a particular stage of capitalism itself without the means of production being thereby socially appropriated. Indeed, far from the socialist property being identical with working-class state property, socialism excludes not only individual private property but also working-class state property in the means of production. The very first phase of the association, along with the social appropriation of the means of production, arrives on the historical scene only at the end of the transformation period to which the working-class state belongs. Exchange and distribution. Let us now turn to Lenin's treatment of exchange and distribution under socialism. With regard to exchange relations, Lenin excludes commodity production and money from socialism. The end of capitalism would signify, quote, the suppression, end quote, of commodity production, and the new society would be characterized by organized statewide distribution of, quote, products, end quote, replacing commerce. It should be stressed that contrary to a widely held view, particularly propagated by later Soviet reformers, the abolition of commodity, money, relations under socialism was Lenin's invariant position both in the pre-NEP and in the NEP periods of the Soviet economy. What changed in Lenin's perspective in the later period was his view concerning commodity production during the transition to socialism. Contrary to a simplistic view he had held during, quote, war communism, end quote, he later stressed the need for the party to, quote, grasp trade as the link, end quote, during the transition period while reaffirming the non-commodity character of what he called the, quote, socialist exchange of products, end quote. Regarding the distribution of the means of consumption under socialism, Lenin's reflections are almost exclusively confined to the State and Revolution, Chapter 5, on which is drawn in the present discussion. On the division of the consumable part of the total social product among the individual producers in socialism, understood as the first phase of communism, Lenin mostly paraphrases Marx's Goethe-Kritik, which we have already analyzed. However, Lenin adds here a couple of ideas of his own that are not specifically Marx's. Referring to what Marx calls the remaining, quote, bourgeois right, end quote, in the first phase of communism, Lenin envisages the equality of, quote, labor and wage, end quote, for all citizens now transformed into, quote, hired employees of the state, end quote, where, further, the enforcement of the bourgeois right would, according to him, necessitate the presence of the, quote, bourgeois state, end quote. Let us examine Lenin's ideas on exchange and distribution under socialism. Regarding exchange relations, Lenin basically follows Marx on the elimination of commodity-money relations in socialism. However, Lenin's position here is not free from ambiguities. Concerning distribution in socialism, by envisaging, quote, the equality of labor and wage, end quote, for producers and regarding them as, quote, hired employees, end quote, of the state, Lenin is introducing wage labor in socialism. Wage is a specific form of labor remuneration, Marx shows, is unique to capitalism, and in the society of associated producers there is no wage system. Denounced by Marx as a, quote, system of slavery, end quote, in the very text that Lenin paraphrases. We saw earlier that the distribution of the means of consumption through labor tokens, as envisaged by Marx, has nothing to do with their distribution through wage remuneration. In the same way, the very idea of, quote, hired employees, end quote, contradicts the socialist character of society. Indeed, in his inaugural address to the International in 1864, Marx expressly opposes capitalism's, quote, hired labor, end quote, to socialism's, quote, associated labor, end quote. Next, Lenin affirms the existence of state in socialism. First, Lenin speaks of, quote, statewide, end quote, distribution of products and of socialist exchange of, quote, state products, end quote. Again, as we mentioned above, he envisages the citizens under socialism as hired employees of the state, receiving wages, and, moreover, postulates a, quote, bourgeois state, end quote, without the bourgeoisie, to enforce, quote, bourgeois right, end quote, in socialism. It should be clear that Lenin's position here is the opposite of Marx's. For Marx, the existence of the state contradicts the existence of the producer's free association. Even when socialism is equated with communism's first phase, there is no place here for the state. The first phase of communism starts only after the end of the transformation period, along with the end of the proletarian state which presided over it. The alleged necessity of a bourgeois state to enforce bourgeois right is unwarranted by Marx's text, and is only Lenin's own gloss on the Gotha critique. Lenin's logic is really baffling. Whatever, quote, bourgeois right, end quote, remains in the sphere of distribution, it does not require a particular political apparatus, a state, least of all a bourgeois state, to enforce it. Marx specifically envisages society itself distributing not only labor tokens among its members, but also labor power and means of production among different branches of production. The two elements which Lenin seems to be connecting to reach his conclusion are to be found in two analytically separate sections in Marx's 1875, quote, marginal notes, end quote. One on the distribution of consumer goods, the other on the state. Marx speaks of the distribution of consumer goods in the new society in alternative ways in his different works, reference to which were given earlier. But nowhere does he bring in the state to enforce the, quote, bourgeois right, end quote. Whatever, quote, bourgeois right, end quote, remains in the sphere of distribution does not require a political apparatus to enforce it. Indeed, Marx specifically envisages society itself as distributing the labor tokens among its members along with the allocation of labor power and material means of production along different spheres of production. This is, of course, as it should be, since, as the manifesto affirms, public power in the new society does no longer have a political character. Lenin refers to a question posed by Marx on the possibility of a role to be played by state in communism. In the passage referred to by Lenin, Marx speaks of the future transformation of the, quote, state type, end quote, rather than of the existence of the state as such in communism. A reading of the relevant section of Marx's text shows clearly that far from himself bringing in the question of state in communism. Incidentally, Marx does not speak here of the first phase of communism, but of communism as such. He is simply referring to the Lassallean confusion on the question as it appears in the, quote, program, and quite legitimately speculates whether there would be any state-type function in the association. Here the, quote, present-day state, end quote, is brought in to serve as an analogy, in the same way as Marx, while discussing the distribution of means of consumption in the future society, brings in commodity exchange, quote, just for a parallel, end quote. It no way follows that either the state or commodity production prevails in the association. Doesn't Marx himself denounce in the same Gotha critique, quote, servile faith in the state, end quote, as, quote, remote from socialism, end quote. A second internationalist vision. By obscuring the distinction between production and ownership relations, by equating the juridical abolition of individual, private ownership with establishment of social ownership, and identifying the latter with proletarian state ownership, by not eliminating state and wage labor, Lenin's socialist economy turns out to be much closer to the Lassalle-Kautsky state owned and planned economy than to Marx's emancipatory project of, quote, union of free individuals, end quote. Lenin ultimately does not seem to have succeeded in wholly transcending the Second International's narrow horizon concerning the future society.